The crackle of the campfire did little to soothe Abigail Turner's frayed nerves as she cradled her 6-month-old son, Samuel, against her chest. His small body burned with fever, his whimpers growing fainter with each passing hour. The wagon train had stopped for the night in the vast expanse of the Texas wilderness, still 3 days' journey from their destination of Terlingua, a mining settlement where Abigail hoped to start anew after the death of her husband. "Please, my sweet boy," she whispered, pressing her lips to Samuel's forehead. "Please fight this fever." Her fingers trembled as she dipped a cloth into a basin of water and pressed it to his flushed skin. The year was 1878, and life on the frontier offered little mercy to a 22-year-old widow traveling with a sick infant. The nearest doctor was in Terlingua, but Samuel's condition had worsened rapidly since sundown. Abigail feared he wouldn't survive the night. "Mrs. Turner." A voice came from outside her wagon. "May I come in?" "Yes," she called, her voice breaking. The canvas flap lifted, and the silhouette of a man appeared. Matthew Kane, the cowboy hired to guide their wagon train through the treacherous terrain. His tall frame stooped as he entered, hat in hand. At 28, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had seen much of the world's harshness. "The others said your boy's taken ill," he said. His deep voice softened with concern. Abigail nodded, unable to speak as tears welled in her eyes. She'd been trying to appear strong in front of the other settlers, but her resolve was crumbling. Matthew moved closer, kneeling beside her. "May I?" he asked, extending his hands. Hesitantly, Abigail transferred her precious bundle to the cowboy's arms. His large, calloused hands, which she'd seen break wild horses and fire a rifle with deadly accuracy, now cradled her son with surprising tenderness. "Let him rest in my arms," Matthew said, adjusting the blanket around Samuel. "I've held worse pain than fever." Something in his voice, a hint of old grief, made Abigail look up sharply. Their eyes met, and an unspoken understanding passed between them. "When I was 17, I watched my younger brother waste away from scarlet fever," he explained quietly. "I held him through the worst of it. Your boy here, he's got fight in him. I can feel it." Matthew shifted Samuel so that the baby's head rested against his chest, directly over his heart. "The sound of a heartbeat can be powerful medicine," he said. "My mother taught me that." Abigail watched, mesmerized, as her son's restless movements gradually stilled. For the first time in hours, Samuel seemed peaceful. "You should rest," Matthew told her. "I'll keep watch over him." "I couldn't possibly. You'll be no good to your son if you collapse from exhaustion," he insisted gently. "Take this chance to sleep. I promise I'll wake you if there's any change." Too tired to argue, Abigail stretched out on her bedroll. The last thing she saw before sleep claimed her was the silhouette of the cowboy, rocking her son by the soft glow of the lantern light. She woke with a start, disoriented in the pre-dawn darkness. Fear gripped her heart as she remembered Samuel's condition. She sat up abruptly to find Matthew still there, her son sleeping soundly in his arms. "His fever broke about 2 hours ago," Matthew whispered. "He's cooler to the touch now." Abigail reached out with trembling fingers to feel her son's forehead. Where before his skin had burned like fire, now it was merely warm. "You saved him," she breathed, unable to believe it. Matthew shook his head. "No, madam, he saved himself. I just gave him a comfortable place to fight his battle." As the first light of dawn filtered through the canvas, Abigail took her son back into her arms. Samuel's eyes fluttered open, clear and bright for the first time in days, and he gazed up at her with recognition. "Thank you," she said, looking up at Matthew with tears streaming down her face. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." The cowboy stood, settling his hat back on his head. "No need for repayment, Mrs. Turner. We've still got rough country ahead before we reach Terlingua. You focus on keeping that boy strong." As he stepped out of the wagon, Abigail realized that in the middle of the vast, unforgiving wilderness, she had found something she'd thought lost forever: hope. The wagon train resumed its journey as the sun climbed higher in the Texas sky. Abigail kept Samuel close, marveling at his improved condition. The baby was still weak, but his breathing was steady, and he had taken some milk that morning, a promising sign. Throughout the day, Matthew rode alongside their wagon, occasionally checking on them. His eyes, the color of weathered sage, would meet Abigail's briefly before he'd tip his hat and continue his duties. By nightfall, when they made camp near a creek, Abigail felt bold enough to seek him out. She found him tending to his horse, a magnificent chestnut gelding with a white blaze down its face. Samuel slept peacefully in a sling across her chest. "Mr. Kane," she called softly. He turned, his expression softening at the sight of them. "Mrs. Turner, how's the little one faring?" "Much better, thanks to you." She stepped closer. "I wanted to invite you to share our supper tonight. It's not much, just beans and cornbread, but I'd be honored if you'd join us." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "The honor would be mine." They sat by her small campfire, away from the main gathering of settlers. Matthew spoke little, but when he did, his words carried weight. He told her of growing up on a small ranch in Kansas, of losing his parents to a raid when he was 16, of raising his brother alone until illness took him too. "What brought you to Texas?" Abigail asked, watching as he gently bounced Samuel on his knee. The baby had taken an immediate liking to him, clutching at his bandana with curious fingers. "The war," he answered simply. "After it ended, I couldn't go back to Kansas. Too many ghosts. I drifted south, found work with the cattle drives. Been guiding settlers like yourself ever since." "And do you have a home somewhere, a place you return to?" Matthew looked out at the darkening horizon. "The trail is my home, Mrs. Turner. Please," she said, "call me Abigail." He nodded, the firelight catching in his eyes. "Abigail, then." In that moment, with her son content in the arms of this quiet, steady man, Abigail felt a flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with fear or worry. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced since before her husband's death, a stirring of something that felt dangerously like attraction. The remainder of their journey to Terlingua was marked by increasingly frequent interactions. Matthew would often ride beside Abigail's wagon, sharing stories or simply offering companionable silence. He taught her how to better handle the rains, how to read the weather from the clouds, and how to identify edible plants along the trail. Samuel continued to improve, growing stronger each day. The baby seemed to light up whenever Matthew was near, a fact that did not go unnoticed by the other travelers. "That cowboy's sweet on you," remarked Sarah Jenkins, a plump woman traveling with her husband to open a general store in Terlingua. "And on that baby of yours, too." Abigail felt her cheeks warm. "He's just being kind." "Kind, yes," Sarah replied with a knowing smile, "but I've never seen him be quite so attentive with any other family he's guided." 4 days later, the wagon train crested a hill, and Terlingua came into view, a collection of adobe buildings, tents and wooden structures nestled against the backdrop of rugged mountains. The settlement had sprung up around the quicksilver mines that dotted the area, drawing prospectors, merchants, and families seeking opportunity in the harsh but mineral-rich land. "There it is," Matthew said, riding up beside Abigail's wagon. "Your new home." She studied his face, searching for any clue to his feelings. "And where will you go now, Mr. Kane?" "Matthew," he corrected gently. "I've got another group to guide back east in a week's time." Abigail felt a sharp pang of disappointment. "So you'll be leaving soon?" He nodded, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. That's the way of it. As they entered the town, Abigail took in her surroundings with a mixture of hope and trepidation. Terlingua was rougher than she'd imagined, with dusty streets lined by saloons and boarding houses. Men in mining clothes eyed the wagon train with interest, their faces weathered by sun and hard labor. Matthew guided them to the center of town, where a two-story building bore a sign reading Terlingua Hotel and Boarding House. "This is where I leave you," he told the settlers, dismounting to help them organize their arrival. "Mrs. Henderson runs a respectable establishment. She'll see you settled until you find permanent lodgings." One by one, the families thanked him and began unloading their possessions. Matthew helped where needed, carrying trunks and directing people to various services in town. All the while, Abigail waited, Samuel cradled against her shoulder, unsure of what to say or how to say goodbye to the man who had saved her son's life. Finally, as the sun began to set, Matthew approached her wagon. "I've arranged a room for you and the boy," he said, holding out a hand to help her down. "Best one in the house with a view of the mountains." Abigail took his hand, feeling the strength in his grip as she stepped down. "That's very thoughtful of you. It's the least I could do." An awkward silence fell between them. In the distance, someone began playing a fiddle, the melancholy tune drifting through the evening air. "Well," Matthew said finally, "I wish you both the very best, Abigail. Terlingua's a good town, despite its rough edges. You'll find your place here. And you," she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Will you pass through again?" He looked down, adjusting his hat. "The trails bring me back this way every few months." Hope flickered in Abigail's heart. Perhaps you might check on us next time you're in town, to see how Samuel is faring." Matthew's eyes met hers, and for a moment she glimpsed something vulnerable in their depths. "I'd like that very much." With a final tip of his hat, he mounted his horse and rode toward the livery stable, his figure silhouetted against the setting sun. Abigail watched him go, wondering if she would indeed see him again, or if he was merely being kind to a woman he had helped through a difficult time. Settling into life in Terlingua proved both harder and easier than Abigail had anticipated. Mrs. Henderson, the boarding house proprietress, took a liking to Samuel and often offered to watch him while Abigail searched for work. Within a week, she secured a position at the town's only restaurant, serving meals to miners and travelers. The work was exhausting, but it paid enough to cover their room and board with a little left over. Abigail began to save what she could, dreaming of one day opening a small bakery of her own. Her husband had been a baker before the consumption took him, and she had learned much at his side. As the weeks passed, she made cautious friendships with some of the other women in town: the school teacher, Miss Winters, the doctor's wife, Mrs. Calloway, and even Dahlia, a kind-hearted woman who worked at the Painted Lady Saloon. Through these connections, Abigail began to feel less like an outsider and more like a part of the community. But each time a group of riders entered town, or when the stagecoach arrived from El Paso, she found herself searching for a familiar figure in a worn leather duster and wide-brimmed hat. Matthew Kane remained in her thoughts, though she tried to dismiss her feelings as nothing more than gratitude. Nearly 3 months after their arrival in Terlingua, as autumn painted the desert landscape in muted golds and reds, Abigail was working the lunch shift when the restaurant door opened. She turned, plates balanced on her arm, and nearly dropped them at the sight of Matthew standing in the doorway, trail dust on his clothes and uncertainty in his eyes. "Mr. Kane," she breathed, unable to hide her smile. He removed his hat, revealing hair that had grown slightly longer since she'd last seen him. "Miss Abigail, I was hoping I might find you here. She gestured to an empty table by the window. "Please sit. I'll be with you in a moment." With hands that suddenly trembled, she delivered the plates she was carrying, then hurried to inform the owner she was taking her break early. When she returned to Matthew's table, she found him gazing out the window at the street where a group of children played. "How is your son?" he asked as she sat across from him. "Samuel is thriving," she answered, her face lighting up at the mention of her child. "Mrs. Henderson watches him during my shifts. He's crawling now, getting into everything." Matthew smiled, and Abigail was struck by how it transformed his usually solemn face. "I'm glad to hear it. I've thought about you both often." Her heart quickened at his words. "Have you? We've thought of you as well. Samuel still has the bandana you gave him before you left. He won't sleep without it." A look of pleasure crossed Matthew's face. "I've brought him something else. Nothing fancy. Just a small wooden horse I carved during the evenings on the trail. He'll love it," Abigail assured him, touched by the gesture. "Are you in town long? A few days, maybe a week. I've delivered a herd to the Double C Ranch outside of town. Thought I'd rest up before taking on another job." Abigail hesitated, then gathered her courage. "I finish my shift at 4. Perhaps you'd like to come for supper. To see Samuel." The smile that spread across Matthew's face was answer enough. That evening, Abigail prepared a simple meal in the small kitchen at the back of the boarding house. Samuel sat on a blanket nearby, playing with wooden blocks Mrs. Henderson had given him. At precisely 6 o'clock, a knock came at the door. Matthew stood on the threshold, freshly shaven and wearing a clean shirt beneath his vest. In one hand he held the promised wooden horse, in the other, a small bouquet of desert wildflowers. "These are for you," he said, offering the flowers with uncharacteristic shyness. Abigail accepted them with a blush. "They're beautiful. Please come in." As soon as Matthew stepped into the room, Samuel let out a delighted gurgle, raising his arms to be picked up. Without hesitation, Matthew scooped the baby into his arms, his face softening as Samuel patted his cheeks with chubby hands. "He remembers you," Abigail said, watching them with a full heart. "Seems that way," Matthew replied, his voice gruff with emotion. He presented the wooden horse to Samuel, who immediately began exploring it with curious fingers. They shared a meal of rabbit stew and cornbread, talking easily about the changes in Terlingua, the people Matthew had met on his travels, and Abigail's hopes for the future. As the evening wore on, it felt to Abigail as if they had known each other for years rather than months. After Samuel fell asleep, they sat by the window, watching as stars appeared in the vast Texas sky. In the soft lamplight, Matthew seemed less the hardened trailsman and more a man with dreams and regrets of his own. "I've never thanked you properly," Abigail said quietly. "For what you did for Samuel." Matthew's gaze remained on the stars. "There's no need for thanks. Any decent man would have done the same." "But it wasn't any man," she insisted. "It was you, and I," she faltered, suddenly uncertain. He turned to her then, his eyes reflecting the lamplight. "What is it, Abigail?" "I've missed you," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "More than I should, perhaps." The silence that followed seemed to stretch into eternity. Then, with careful movements as if approaching a skittish colt, Matthew reached across the space between them and took her hand in his. "I've missed you too," he confessed. "Every mile of trail, every town I've passed through, I've thought of you and the boy. I told myself I was just checking in, making sure you were settled. But the truth is, I couldn't stay away." Abigail's heart raced as his thumb traced gentle circles on the back of her hand. "I'm glad you came back." They sat like that, hands entwined, neither willing to break the spell by speaking further. But in that quiet moment, Something shifted between them, a recognition of feelings that had taken root during those difficult days on the trail and had grown stronger in absence. When Matthew finally rose to leave, he hesitated at the door. "May I call on you again tomorrow?" Abigail nodded, unable to suppress her smile. "Samuel and I would like that very much." The week that followed was the happiest Abigail had known since arriving in Terlingua. Each day, Matthew would meet her after her shift, sometimes with Samuel in tow if Mrs. Henderson had errands to run. They explored the town together, venturing to the small creek that ran behind the settlement, or simply sitting on the boarding house porch as the sun set over the mountains. Matthew proved to be a natural with Samuel, patient and playful in ways that made Abigail's heart swell. The baby would squeal with delight when the cowboy tossed him gently in the air or let him ride on his shoulders. "You're good with him," Abigail remarked one evening as they watched Samuel crawl determinedly across the floor, chasing after the wooden horse. "He makes it easy," Matthew replied. "He's a good boy, strong like his mother." Their eyes met, and Abigail felt warmth spread through her chest at the admiration in his gaze. Since that first night, they had not spoken directly of their feelings, but every shared glance, every accidental touch, seemed to draw them closer together. On Matthew's 6th day in town, as they walked back from a picnic by the creek, he suddenly stopped, his expression troubled. "What is it?" Abigail asked, shifting Samuel to her other hip. "I received word today. There's a group needing guidance to Fort Davis. They leave the day after tomorrow." The news hit Abigail like a physical blow. "So soon?" Matthew nodded, his jaw tight. "It's good pay and the work is steady," but he broke off, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "But what?" she prompted gently. "But I find myself reluctant to leave," he admitted. "These past days with you and Samuel, they've meant more to me than I can say." Abigail stepped closer to him, summoning her courage. "Then don't go." His eyes widened. "What? Stay," she said simply. "At least a while longer. Terlingua is growing. They need men who know the land, who can handle themselves. You could find work here." Hope and uncertainty warred in Matthew's expression. "Abigail, I'm not sure I'm fit for settled life. I've been on the move so long, I don't know if I remember how to stay in one place." "You could learn," she suggested, her heart in her throat. "If you wanted to." He reached out, gently tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "And is that what you want, for me to stay?" "Yes," she whispered, no longer hiding from the truth. "That's what I want." For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then Matthew leaned forward, his lips meeting hers in a kiss so tender it brought tears to her eyes. Samuel, caught between them, let out a delighted giggle, patting both their faces as if giving his approval. When they finally drew apart, Matthew's smile held a certainty that hadn't been there before. "I'll speak to the rancher at the Double C tomorrow, see if he might have need of someone with my skills." As they continued their walk back to town, Matthew's arm around her shoulders and Samuel chattering happily, Abigail felt a sense of rightness she hadn't experienced since losing her husband. She wasn't replacing what she had lost, but building something new, something unexpected and precious. The following day, Matthew rode out to the Double C Ranch at dawn. By noon, he returned to town with news that changed everything. "The foreman offered me a position," he told Abigail, his eyes bright with excitement. "They're expanding their operation, driving cattle up to Colorado in the spring. In the meantime, they need someone to help break horses and patrol the boundaries. It's good, steady work." Abigail's heart soared. "So you're staying?" "I'm staying," he confirmed, taking her hands in his. "At least until spring, and after that, well, we'll see where we stand." That evening they walked to the edge of town, where the desert stretched out before them in the dying light. Samuel had stayed behind with Mrs. Henderson, giving them a rare moment alone. "I want to be honest with you, Abigail," Matthew said as they watched the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. "I've lived a hard life, done things I'm not proud of. I've drifted so long, I'm not sure I know how to be the kind of man you and Samuel deserve." Abigail squeezed his hand. "I'm not asking you to be perfect, Matthew. None of us are. I just want you to be yourself, the man who held my son through the night when fever threatened to take him. The man who came back, even when the trail called him elsewhere." He turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "I can't promise it will be easy. The life I've known doesn't disappear overnight, but I can promise to try every day to be worthy of the trust you've placed in me." "That's all anyone can ask," she replied softly. As darkness fell around them, Matthew drew her close, his kiss deeper and more urgent than before. Abigail responded with equal fervor, allowing herself to embrace the feelings she had kept carefully guarded since first meeting him on the trail. When they finally parted, breathless and flushed, Matthew pressed his forehead to hers. "I never expected to find you," he murmured. "Out of all the trails I've ridden, all the places I've been, somehow I found you." Abigail smiled up at him, her heart fuller than she'd thought possible. "Perhaps you weren't finding me," she suggested. "Perhaps you were finding home." The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm as autumn deepened toward winter. Matthew rode out to the Double C each morning, returning to town in the evenings. He took a room at the boarding house, though he spent most of his free time with Abigail and Samuel. On Sundays, when the restaurant was closed, they would pack a simple meal and ride out into the desert, Matthew teaching Abigail to shoot a rifle and identify animal tracks, while Samuel napped in the shade of a blanket strung between cacti. The townspeople quickly adjusted to seeing them together. Some, like Mrs. Henderson, approved heartily of the match. "About time that man put down roots," she told Abigail one morning as they prepared breakfast. "Been watching him pass through for years, always with that lonesome look in his eyes. Not anymore, though. You've chased those shadows away." Others were more reserved in their judgment, particularly the town's more proper ladies who whispered behind fans about the widow and the drifter. But Abigail paid them little mind. She had survived too much the loss of her husband, the journey west, nearly losing Samuel to fever to concern herself with gossip. As November arrived, bringing cooler temperatures to the desert, Matthew began constructing a small cabin on a plot of land at the edge of town. The Double C owner, impressed with Matthew's work, had offered it as part of his wages. "It's not much," Matthew told Abigail as he showed her the half-built structure. "Just 2 rooms to start, but we can add on as needed." The casual we caught Abigail's attention. "Are you building this for yourself?" she asked carefully. Matthew paused in his hammering, looking up at her with those sage-colored eyes that still made her heart skip. "I'm building it for us, Abigail. For you, me, and Samuel, if you'll have me." She stood very still, hardly daring to breathe. "Are you asking what I think you're asking?" Setting down his hammer, Matthew crossed to where she stood and took both her hands in his. "I'm not a man of fancy words or grand gestures, but I know what I feel when I'm with you and the boy. It's like coming home after years of wandering. I love you, Abigail Turner. I love Samuel as if he were my own son. And if you'll marry me, I swear I'll spend every day trying to make you both happy." Tears filled Abigail's eyes, but they were tears of joy. "Yes," she whispered, throwing her arms around his neck. "Yes, I'll marry you." Their kiss was sealed with the promise of a shared future, no longer 2 solitary figures making their way through a harsh world, but a family, bound by love that had bloomed in the most unexpected of circumstances. They were married 2 weeks later in Terlingua's small church, with Samuel dressed in his finest clothes and the townspeople filling the pews. Mrs. Henderson wept openly, declaring it the most romantic thing she'd seen in all her 63 years. After the ceremony, as friends and neighbors celebrated with music and dancing in the town square, Matthew drew Abigail aside. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. He withdrew a delicate silver locket on a chain. "It belonged to my mother. I've carried it with me all these years, waiting for the right person to give it to." Abigail touched it reverently as he fastened it around her neck. "It's beautiful." "Open it," he encouraged. Inside, he had placed a tiny drawing of Samuel on one side. The other held a lock of golden hair. "From his first haircut," Matthew explained. "I saved it, hoping you wouldn't mind." Abigail closed the locket, pressing it over her heart. "It's perfect, thank you." Matthew pulled her close, his voice low in her ear. "Thank you for giving me a reason to stay." That night, in the privacy of their newly completed cabin, they came together as husband and wife, their passion tempered by tenderness as they explored each other's bodies for the first time. In Matthew's arms, Abigail found both the fierce protection that had first drawn her to him and a gentle vulnerability he showed to no one else. As winter settled over Terlingua, bringing rare snowfall to the desert, the little cabin became a haven of warmth and laughter. Matthew proved to be as skilled at building a home as he had been at navigating the wilderness. He crafted furniture for their small rooms, a rocking chair for Abigail, a crib to replace the basket Samuel had outgrown, a table where they gathered each evening for meals. Samuel took his first steps on Christmas Day, toddling unsteadily from Abigail's arms to Matthew's outstretched hands. The look of pride on Matthew's face as he caught the boy brought tears to Abigail's eyes. "Pa," Samuel babbled, patting Matthew's cheeks in what had become his favorite gesture of affection. Matthew froze, looking to Abigail with a question in his eyes. "It's what you are now," she said softly. "His father in every way that matters." That night, after Samuel was asleep, they lay together in the darkness, planning the future, a larger garden come spring, perhaps another room added to the cabin, the possibility of more children to join their family. "I've been thinking," Matthew said, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on Abigail's bare shoulder. "The bakery you've talked about opening, I believe we could make that happen." Abigail propped herself up on one elbow. "Truly. But the cost? I've saved most of my wages," he explained. "And the Double C has offered me a share in the spring cattle drive. It would be enough for the equipment you need, maybe even a small storefront near the hotel." The fact that he had been planning this, setting aside money to help her realize her dream, touched Abigail deeply. "You do that for me?" Matthew smiled in the moonlight filtering through the window. "I'd do anything for you, Abigail Kane." The name, her new name, still sent a thrill through her. "I love you," she whispered, leaning down to kiss him. "And I love you," he replied, drawing her back into his embrace. "More than I ever thought possible." Spring came early to the Texas desert, bringing with it a profusion of wildflowers that carpeted the usually barren landscape. Abigail's garden flourished under her careful tending, providing fresh vegetables for their table. Samuel, now a sturdy toddler of 15 months, followed Matthew everywhere, mimicking his movements and wearing a miniature hat that Mrs. Henderson had fashioned for him. The cattle drive loomed on the horizon, bringing with it both opportunity and separation. Matthew would be gone for nearly 2 months, driving the herd north to Colorado with the other Double C hands. "I don't have to go," he offered one evening as they sat on their porch, watching Samuel chase fireflies in the yard. "I could stay, find other work." Abigail shook her head, though the thought of his absence made her heart ache. "No, this is important." The money from the drive will help us establish the bakery, and you gave your word to the rancher." Matthew took her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "2 months will pass quickly." "Not quickly enough," she sighed, leaning her head on his shoulder, "but we'll be waiting for you when you return." The morning of his departure dawned clear and cool. Abigail stood at the edge of town, Samuel on her hip, watching as the cowboys assembled for the long journey ahead. Matthew rode over to them, his horse prancing beneath him. "You take care of your mama while I'm gone," he told Samuel, who solemnly nodded as if understanding the importance of the charge. To Abigail he said simply, "I'll come back to you. Always." She reached up, touching his leg, memorizing the feel of him. "We'll be right here." With a final tip of his hat, Matthew joined the other riders, and soon the dust of hundreds of cattle obscured him from view. Abigail stood watching long after they had disappeared from sight, Samuel quiet in her arms as if sensing the significance of the moment. Life continued in Terlingua. Abigail worked her shifts at the restaurant, cared for Samuel, and tended their home. In the evenings, she would sit on the porch with her son, telling him stories about his father, both the one he would never know and the one who would soon return to them. Letters arrived sporadically, carried by riders traveling south. Matthew's handwriting was rough but earnest, detailing the progress of the drive, the beauty of the landscapes they passed through, and always his love for Abigail and Samuel. 6 weeks into Matthew's absence, as Abigail prepared for bed, a wave of nausea overcame her. She barely reached the wash basin before emptying her stomach. The sensation continued for several days, always worst in the mornings. "You're with child, Mrs. Henderson declared after observing Abigail's pallor at breakfast. "I'd stake my life on it." A visit to Dr. Calloway confirmed the older woman's assessment. Abigail was indeed expecting, the baby due in late autumn. Joy surged through her at the news, tempered only by Matthew's absence. She wrote to him immediately, though she knew the letter might not reach him before his return. As the 2-month mark approached, Abigail found herself watching the southern trail with increasing frequency, hoping for a glimpse of the returning cowboys. Samuel would join her vigil, pointing down the road and asking, "Pa, Pa," with hopeful eyes. "Soon, my love," she would assure him, praying it was true. The cattle drive returned on a sweltering June afternoon, the men dusty and trail-worn but triumphant. Abigail stood on their porch, shading her eyes against the sun, searching for the familiar silhouette among the riders. When she spotted him, relief washed over her in a dizzying wave. Matthew rode slightly apart from the others, his hat pulled low over his eyes. Even at a distance, she could see the exhaustion in the set of his shoulders. Samuel, playing in the yard, looked up at the sound of approaching horses. His face lit with recognition, and he took off running, his short legs pumping furiously. "Pa, Pa, Pa, Pa." Matthew dismounted in one fluid motion, kneeling in the dust to catch Samuel as the boy flung himself forward. He held his son tight, eyes closed, face buried in the child's blonde curls. Abigail approached more slowly, drinking in the sight of her husband home at last. When Matthew looked up and saw her, the weariness in his face gave way to pure joy. Still holding Samuel, he stood and crossed to her in 3 long strides. His free arm encircled her waist, drawing her close as his lips found hers in a kiss that spoke of all the longing of their separation. When they finally parted, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "I missed you both something fierce," he murmured. Abigail placed his hand over her still flat abdomen. "We missed you too, all of us." Matthew's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "Abigail, are you saying," she nodded, tears of happiness spilling down her cheeks. "In November." Dr. Calloway confirmed it. With a whoop that startled Samuel into giggles, Matthew lifted Abigail off her feet, spinning her in a circle before setting her gently back down. "Careful with my wife," he admonished himself with a grin. "She's carrying precious cargo." That evening, after Samuel was tucked into bed, they sat together on their porch swing, Matthew's arm around Abigail's shoulders as they gazed at the star-filled sky. "The drive was successful," he told her. "Better than expected. We got top dollar for the herd in Colorado." "That's wonderful," Abigail said, snuggling closer to his side. "The bakery can be yours by the end of summer," Matthew finished for her. "There's a vacant shop next to the general store. Jenkins mentioned the owner's looking to sell." Abigail looked up at him, heart full. "Our dreams are coming true, aren't they?" Matthew brushed a tender kiss across her forehead. "They started coming true the moment you trusted me with your son." The remainder of the summer passed in a blur of activity. Matthew purchased the small storefront, then set about renovating it with help from friends he'd made at the Double C. Abigail ordered equipment from catalogs, planned her menu, and experimented with recipes adapted to the ingredients available in their frontier town. By September, Abigail's bakery opened its doors to the people of Terlingua. The response exceeded even Abigail's optimistic expectations. Miners stopped in for fresh bread before their shifts. Ranchers' wives placed orders for special occasion cakes. Even the saloon girls became regular customers, declaring Abigail's cinnamon rolls the best cure for a night of too much whiskey. Matthew divided his time between the ranch and the bakery, often watching Samuel while Abigail worked. The sight of the tall cowboy with a toddler perched on his shoulders became a familiar one around town. As Abigail's pregnancy progressed, her body rounding with the new life growing within, Matthew became increasingly protective. He insisted on hiring a local girl to help in the bakery, limiting Abigail's hours as her due date approached. "I'm perfectly capable of working," she protested one evening as he massaged her swollen feet. "I know you are," he replied patiently, "but you don't have to do everything yourself anymore. That's what I'm here for." The truth of his words touched her deeply. After years of shouldering burdens alone, first as a young wife caring for an ailing husband, then as a widow making the treacherous journey west with an infant, she was still learning to lean on someone else. "I love you," she said simply, reaching for his hand. Matthew's smile was tender as he placed their joined hands over her belly where their child kicked vigorously. "And I love you, both of you, all three of you," he corrected, glancing toward Samuel's room. November arrived with an unseasonable cold snap. Abigail, now in her 9th month, found herself constantly tired, her back aching from the weight of her pregnancy. Still, she insisted on keeping the bakery open, though she limited herself to lighter tasks while her young assistant handled the ovens. On the 15th of November, as the first light of dawn crept over the mountains, Abigail woke to a sharp pain radiating across her abdomen. She lay still, waiting to see if it would return. When it did, several minutes later, she gently shook Matthew awake. "It's time," she whispered. With a calmness that belied his inner anxiety, Matthew sprang into action. He sent a neighbor boy for the doctor and Mrs. Henderson, then settled Samuel with another family down the street. By mid-morning, Abigail's labor had intensified. She paced the small bedroom, leaning on Matthew during contractions, drawing strength from his steady presence. "You're doing beautifully," Dr. Calloway assured her after checking her progress. "This baby seems eager to meet the world." As noon approached, the pains came faster, harder. Abigail gripped Matthew's hand with each wave, her knuckles white with effort. "I can't," she gasped after a particularly intense contraction. "Matthew, I can't do this." He wiped her forehead with a cool cloth, his voice low and certain. "You can, Abigail. You're the strongest person I know. Just a little longer and we'll meet our child." Drawing courage from his faith in her, Abigail bore down with renewed determination. 20 minutes later, a lusty cry filled the room as their daughter entered the world, small fists waving in indignation. "A girl, Doctor," Calloway announced, placing the squalling infant on Abigail's chest. "A perfect little girl." Matthew stared at the tiny being they had created, wonder and love etched on his face. When he finally found his voice, it was rough with emotion. "She's beautiful, like her mother." They named her Elizabeth Grace Kane Elizabeth for Matthew's mother, Grace for the blessing she represented in their lives. Samuel, brought home that evening, approached his baby sister with solemn curiosity, placing a gentle kiss on her forehead before declaring, "My baby." The first few weeks with Elizabeth were a whirlwind of feeding, changing, and precious little sleep. Matthew proved as adept with a newborn as he had been with Samuel, walking the floors at night when Elizabeth was fussy, changing diapers without complaint, and making sure Abigail had time to rest. On Christmas Eve, with Samuel finally asleep and Elizabeth nursing contentedly at Abigail's breast, Matthew sat beside them on the bed, his arm curled protectively around his family. "I've been thinking," he said, watching his daughter's tiny hand grasp his finger, "about the fever that brought us together." Abigail looked up at him curiously. "What about it? I told you then that I'd held worse pain than fever, and I had my brother's death, the war, years of drifting without purpose." His voice softened as he gazed at Elizabeth, then at Samuel's sleeping form in the crib nearby. "But I never knew there was a flip side to that pain. That love could be just as powerful, just as overwhelming." Tears pricked Abigail's eyes at the raw honesty in his words. "Sometimes I think Samuel's illness was a blessing in disguise. Without it, you might never have stopped at our wagon that night." Matthew pressed a kiss to her temple. "I'd like to think we were meant to find each other, fever or no. Some trails are mapped out long before we set foot on them." As the new year of 1880 dawned, the Kane family settled into a rhythm that balanced work and home. The bakery continued to thrive under Abigail's guidance, becoming not just a business but a gathering place for the community. Matthew took on more responsibility at the Double C, eventually being promoted to foreman, a position that allowed him to spend more nights at home with his family. Samuel grew into a sturdy 3-year-old with his mother's gentle nature and his adoptive father's love of horses. Elizabeth, with Matthew's dark hair and Abigail's blue eyes, proved to be a determined child, crawling early and forever trying to keep up with her brother. In the spring of 1881, as wildflowers once again carpeted the desert, Matthew and Abigail celebrated their second wedding anniversary by riding out to the spot where they had first admitted their feelings for each other. They spread a blanket beneath a mesquite tree, the children playing nearby under Mrs. Henderson's watchful eye. "You ever regret it?" Abigail asked as they lay side by side, watching clouds drift across the vast Texas sky. "Giving up the trail for a settled life?" Matthew propped himself on one elbow, studying her face with those sage green eyes that still made her heart race. "Not for a single moment," he answered honestly. "The trail was where I hid from pain. The children, our home, this is where I found joy." He leaned down to kiss her, a kiss full of promise and passion and the deep, abiding love that had grown between them over the past 2 years. "Besides," he added with a grin as they drew apart, "who says we can't still have adventures? I'm thinking of breeding horses on our own plot of land. Maybe expanding a bit if the right property becomes available." Abigail smiled up at him, tracing the line of his jaw with gentle fingers. "As long as we're together, Matthew Kane, I'm ready for any adventure." In the distance, Samuel's laughter rang out as he chased butterflies through the wildflowers, Elizabeth toddling determinedly after him. The sun warmed their skin, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of desert sage. It was, Abigail thought, about as perfect as life could be, not without challenges or sorrows, but rich with love and possibility. From the darkest moment of her journey, when fever threatened to take her son, had come the greatest blessing. A man who had held that pain and transformed it, through love, into the foundation of their shared future. As they gathered their children and headed home to Terlingua, the setting sun painting the mountains in gold and crimson, Abigail offered a silent prayer of gratitude for fever and pain, and a cowboy brave enough to face both and, in doing so, to find his way home to her. 5 years later, the Kane Ranch stood as testament to what determination and love could build. What had begun as a small cabin on the edge of town had expanded into a proper ranch house, surrounded by corrals where Matthew's growing herd of horses grazed. The bakery in town still thrived, now managed by Abigail's assistant, while Abigail herself focused on special orders and their growing family. Samuel, now 8, was the spitting image of his birth father in looks, but had Matthew's affinity for horses and the land. Elizabeth, at 5, was a whirlwind of energy and curiosity, forever asking questions that left her parents struggling for answers. And 3-year-old James, born during a rare winter thunderstorm, combined his sister's determination with his father's quiet strength. On a warm June afternoon, as Abigail sat on the porch shelling peas, she watched Matthew teaching Samuel the basics of breaking a young colt. Elizabeth perched on the corral fence, offering unsolicited advice, while James napped in the shade nearby. The years had added a few silver strands to Matthew's dark hair and deepened the laugh lines around his eyes, but to Abigail, he was more handsome than ever, his body still lean and strong, his movements sure as he demonstrated to Samuel the proper way to approach the nervous horse. A wave of contentment washed over her as she observed her family. From the darkest moment of her life had come this abundance of joy, all because a cowboy had offered to hold her feverish child one desperate night on the trail to Terlingua. "Let him rest in my arms," Matthew had said. "I've held worse pain than fever." And in holding that pain, hers and his own, he had created space for healing, for love, for the family that now flourished under the vast Texas sky. When Matthew glanced up and caught her watching, he tipped his hat with a smile that still, after all these years, made her heart skip a beat. It was a smile that promised forever, a promise he renewed each day in 1,000 small ways. And Abigail Kane, once a frightened widow with a sick child, now surrounded by the life they had built together, smiled back with all the love in her heart. Some fevers, it seemed, were meant to burn, not to destroy, but to forge something unbreakable, something that would endure through all the seasons of their lives.